Okay, awesome. All right. Yay, I'm honored. I'm very excited to share. So through 2018 and 2020, I was in People's Park doing fieldwork focusing on sound, um, and soundscapes in particular, which was something I focused on after studying R. Mary Schaefer, and he focused on the idea of essentially studying a landscape in an urban environment or in nature environment and considering the sound, like the panoramic sound around it, but both like materiality and sound symbolism. So I get to go into politics as well as the natural experience in the daily life at Park. My supervisor was Professor Charles, and this presentation that is from sound studies as well as share the process of my research and my findings. Okay. So I'm just gonna break it down the momentum to People's Park, what essentially inspired People's Park when it was established in the People's Park crisis. And so it seems as though People's Park was a materialization of the momentum from the free speech movement. It was essentially where the prosperity and the hope and all the love and that had everything that like people had hoped for, it was essentially materialized and planted into the ground of People's Park. And so People's Park is located South Campus of Berkeley. It was established in spring of 1969 after the university had purchased the land, but the university had left it barren and after demolishing a neighborhood, and then they left the land as a swampland because there's a creek that ran through and they actually couldn't afford building there. So the land had been left barren for a year, and then locals and neighbors decided to establish a park because it was actually becoming dangerous for children. Children were playing there, and the swampland just wasn't, it was an eyesore. So the neighbors established a park, but by summer of 1969, the People's Park crisis occurred. And the state and the university fought back and brought tanks, and I'll share a little bit more about the history of that in a bit. But yeah, there was a scary war, and like the battle began in 1969. I was inspired to study People's Park and the free speech movement after learning more about Michael Rossman, and he talks about an empty clenched fist against the oppressor, but actually planted something in the ground that could grow and could bear forth into the world the kinds of health that we felt gathering inside ourselves, intertwined with all the craziness and death of American society at that point. Before I entered the park, my hypothesis was People's Park offers a space open for people to find a sense of agency in their authentic voice. The support behind my hypothesis and was based off of initial findings related to the history as well as my own perception. People's Park is influenced by Berkeley's history and the free speech movement. I had gathered from the park historical mural that shares our local environment has offered social change and political freedom. So if anyone's been alongside Hay Street on the right side where the music building is, there is a beautiful mural that's about 20 feet tall, and it extends across the building, and it shares the history of Berkeley. And this particular photo shows the building of the park, or the establishment of the park. And based off of my outside perception, like basically while looking into the park before I actually stepped into the park, it appeared People's Park offered a sense of agency even for the homeless community. People's Park offers public space for both interpersonal interactions and daily routine life, with less of a reminder of social class and law enforcement. So I began my thesis by focusing on the phenomenology of voice, place, perception, and the body. And throughout my research process, this was particularly what I focused on. These phenomenologies allowed me to ground and essentially create the ordering of my chapters. Over here is a beautiful image of the sign that's on the north side of the park. It's a very well-known sign. It's shared a lot on newspapers and websites, and I think I found it on Instagram the other day. So anyway, it basically means that down below everybody gets a blister. It's everyone. In my mind, I think it's basically everybody participates, and it takes a little bit of everyone to establish a community. During my research, I had 4 main activities. It wasn't in a particular order, but I did start with oral history, where I listened to, at the Bancroft Library, I listened to different interviews from 1969 during the People's Park crisis, and it was very fascinating. It offered a lot of knowledge about the history, so I had that in mind when I stepped in and started participating in People's Park committee meetings. The committee allowed me essentially to settle into the park, and I got to know people through the committee members, and I started feeling more safe in the park. As I started meeting more people, I started interviewing particularly homeless, as that what became my main focus, was basically the experience of residing and visiting the park every day. During my IRB process, I actually wasn't allowed to interview. I was told I wasn't allowed to interview people in the park for safety reasons. So I interviewed people at Pete's nearby. And then when COVID hit, I wasn't able to continue interviews in person. So I basically hit the history books and started studying 50 years of Berkeley and People's Park history. My research questions throughout my thesis was they were kind of shifted, but these were the ones that landed throughout my research. And they became the most important anthropologically speaking. How is the People's Park community affected by histories of a battle for land? Who gets to embody free speech? Who is convincing enough for decision making? How do people relate with the place? How and why do people find a sense of agency? So I really get to ground into sound studies and the literature by ethnomusicologists and anthropologists and professor at New Mexico, or University of Mexico. Sorry, guys. University of New Mexico, Albuquerque, Stephen Felt. He's amazing. I hope to meet him someday. But he conceptualized the research method, acoustomology, after 25 years of field notes and audio recordings during his field work with Kaluli people in the Bazavi rainforest. He studied Kaluli song and found essentially that their song documented history and shifted the way people perceived history, and then altered the course of history, and therefore was presented a form of knowledge production. So he uses sound to know local experience of worldings, and by paying attention and listening to acoustics as a way of knowing. The two acoustomological approaches, the two main ones, I'm not sure if he's gathered more, but these are the ones I focused on, were listening to histories of listening and knowing in action. Listening to listen is always having an ear to the agency and positionality in social and place relations. I consider it the idea of listening to people's stories that they have heard and what's been passed on through time. And then knowing in action is paying attention to histories and being in the field with and through sound. It's essentially having the histories that you listen to at hand and then dropping into the field and paying attention to sound and seeing how they relate and understanding the temporalities of the histories through that way. And a quote, a simple way he put it is a knowing with and knowing through the audible, because he focuses on the materiality of sound. So the audible. One of my interlocutors, Running Wolf, he's Indigenous and has great stories to share, and I couldn't really share everything here. I had to condense a lot of information, but he shared his experience about when he was at elementary school, and when during the People's Park crisis, they were launching tear gas from helicopters, and he talked about how the gas had spread all the way to the elementary school. And I asked him if that was traumatizing and about his experience and how that's impacted him today. And he said that it was empowering because he recognized that there's hope for change. And here's his quote here. The sound of police launching tear gas was to me a victory. It's a weird thing, you'll probably only hear this from me, but helicopters is an enjoyable sound that you're doing. You're disrupting the system so badly that they need to bring out helicopters. So he told me every time he hears helicopters, he feels a sense of hope. And I consider this histories of listening to victory. So it's like hearing helicopters allows us to continue to listen to victory because of history, recognizing history. And here's a beautiful mural between the bathrooms at People's Park that has sustained through time despite some of the graffiti. A person I interviewed talked about how the graffiti doesn't really seem to disrupt anything, any of the words, and it seems as though they almost fit in place. I interviewed a People's Park committee member who is also an ethnomusicologist, activist, performer, song performer, musician. And she wrote here the lyrics from Leonon Rosselman, his song, The World Turned Upside Down. And she correlates this song with the park history. She feels as though the park coincides with the Diggers, the history of the Diggers, where in 1649, a royal family purchased land and considered it their property, and essentially were making everyone displaced, but instead they decided to just plant themselves and squat on the land. So my interlocutor considers this to be a similar history to the park and finds it to be the anthem of the park, and she performs it during a lot of reunions and anniversaries, events, concerts, and finds that people are really connected to it. And I found as though this itself was a listening of history. So it's essentially documenting history and then actually putting it on the wall, putting the song lyrics on the wall, and then manifesting these lyrics into performance. And it's all just a listening of history that continues on. As I continued my fieldwork in People's Park, I began to hear a lot about free speech, and the People's Park Committee declared the free speech principle. And I was really curious about the establishment of this principle and its temporalities. And I found a variety of things, but essentially I heard from the committee that there's a lot, it gets controversial. I'll share in the next slide. But here I found an article written by the committee. Our park, the People's Park, was born from a dream of free speech and common space in a turbulent time. It has been threatened and defended many times over the years. So for the battle for the park over the last few years, or 50 years, free speech has been the main focus, along with having open space and justice. This was something I also heard from a co-founder during a People's Park Committee meeting. So with this, so recognizing free speech and finding it a part of history, and knowing histories, I took them in hand and started immersing myself in the environment and trying to see how these histories influence the experience in the contemporary atmosphere today. Here's just a little image that I found, or that I created with a newspaper article, and then a something that was created last year, in 2020 during an open house when they were determining what to do with the park. I guess I didn't share about the development plan. I was just hoping that people knew about it. But yeah, they're planning on building on the house. The university, UC Regents are planning on building on the park in the next year or two. By 2024, they plan to have student housing. And the People's Park Committee and many of the People's Park community came to the open house, and there was a big protest, and it was incredible. But I just really appreciated this because it talks about showing up and speaking out, and this was created by the committee. So there's a lot of theme here. But as I began to study more about free speech, I was thinking if it's really something that's possible and if it's actually set in place. And with this in mind, I studied Nina Sun Edsum and her acoustic blackness, which inspired my acousmatic question about timber and social discrimination, to pay attention to and to consider marginalized voices in the worlding of the place. Looks like I'm a little short on time, but I'll go through these questions quickly. Would it be possible for all voices to be freely expressed and heard in the decision-making process for community agreements? Is there a certain tone or timbre that is not spoken or heard at the park, if anyone, who is silenced? And as I started digging more, I realized that homeless are actually still politically silenced, even within the People's Park Committee. During meetings with the UC Regents, People's Park Committee members more or less dominated the meetings. A lot of homeless didn't feel welcome. During People's Park Committee meetings, there's still silence, and there seems to be still a subordination that occurs within the meetings. I talk a lot about that in my thesis, but I'm going to condense it. But I did find, despite homeless not necessarily being able to embody free speech, there is a sense of agency and a sense of self-ownership, and people do find their own way to live in the park and feel more free and connected. One of my favorite interlocutors was OG1 Kenobi, and the best statement he made was, "I draw to the rhythm of the music." And I focus here on flow and rhythm. And I considered his mode of conflict resolution, his connection to Karate Kid and Wee Wei. I started studying Taoism because of him, which was really exciting. Yeah, if you fight with rhythm and you understand music, then you got their advantage. You understand movement, you understand the flow. So finding flow and rhythm ultimately allowed him to feel like really comfortable in his body, and he felt as though he could stand up for himself in any given moment. Steve the gardener was very exciting. He's the last person I'll talk about. Steve the gardener was fun to talk to in the interview because he's actually finds sound as a sense of agency. When he is an activist protest or tree sitting rather, he told me that sound has a big influence on his experience and how he connects to his environment. Yeah, there's not that essential. Okay, so for my conclusion, I'll just briefly go over how listening to histories of listening, the epistemological approach, led me to study how people listen to the documentation of history. So I got to consider the song lyrics and how they continue through time and allow us to recognize the history of the park. By practicing unknowing in action, I was able to consider the park histories I heard and to then experience the contemporary atmosphere while also experiencing the temporalities of histories. So recognizing the histories, allowed me to experience the park in a different way and consider how people find a sense of agency and through essentially connecting with sound and music and flow and vibes. I didn't get to mention the idea of high and low vibes, but that was mentioned a lot amongst my interlocutors. So yeah, studying sound really allowed me to connect with the environment and recognize the history of the park and how people connect with it today. And I enjoyed my research. It was very exciting. And I recommend you all visiting the park when you can and hopefully telling people more about the history of the park. This is just like brief stuff, but all right.